Good morning, everyone. I'll be reading a passage from Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethpage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus said to his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say these words, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humbled and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt and a foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They had bought the donkey, the colt, and put their cloaks on them and sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee."
Well, he came to Jerusalem that day, a day like many others, and a day that would stand out for many reasons in the years to come. He had come to sell his wares in the markets in Jerusalem, a teeming mass of daily life and Passover preparation. Yes, like a supermarket, before the first snowstorm of the year, or the mall on the day after Thanksgiving, Jerusalem was bustling with people who were preparing for, you name it, guests, strangers, family, celebration. He came with a full load. These special festivals were a great time to earn even extra money for the family. You see, there were special sacrifices to be made in order to please God. And it cost a great deal of money for him to purchase an animal, spotless, without blemish, that would be taken to the temple for a sacrifice. And of course, there was the extra food and all the ceremonial foods to be used for the Passover meal. So much to do, and yet he still had to sell all that he could in order to make this tidy profit he planned on making. Well, and then there was the other trouble of the crowds. Whenever festival days approached, he took extra wares into Jerusalem, and he had to be very careful of thieves who could easily make away with his prized possessions, the strong donkey and its colt. They were, workhorses, they were. And everybody knew it. Why, he was able to stack so much on the backs of these two beasts of burden that the other vendors often were offering him great sums to buy these beasts from him. Now, by the grace of God, he had received these beasts of burden from his cousin, who had repaid him for doing a kindness when his cousin was down on his luck. Our vendor was very proud of these animals, not only for what they could do and the attention that they brought him, they represented to him a symbol of God's goodness. Long ago, you see, his father had taught him that God would care for the man who cared for others. His father would say, "God will show great care for the righteous." It certainly seemed true. His kindness had now begun to put him back ahead of things. Well, he continued bartering with the many other people who were trying to shout out their demands of lower prices, all those customers, and he thought to himself, where do they think they've come? Walmart? It was a good day for the vendors, a seller's market, as they say. and he was already making far more money than he had planned to make. And then he saw them. He saw them approaching out of the corner of his eye. He could always spot them far away when they got close enough, actually, before they got close enough to do harm. Thieves with a lust for his goods rarely were able to hide their desire. But these two exhibited signs far beyond the common criminal. He could tell that they had their eyes on his prize donkey and its colt. They made no efforts to conceal their admiration. And then he thought to himself, what does that look like? Why, that looks like they're relieved. Well, you know, he kept this hefty club there in his kiosk just in case. It wasn't uncommon that he had to convince freeloaders, pickpockets, to clear away from his area. And then there were the types who were looking to relieve him of his beasts of burden. Why, twice in the previous week, in a far less crowded instance, he had to chase and even got a crack at two thieves who had touched his beast's bridle. Slowly, he reached down and he grasped the club. One hand. Kept his one eye on the guys as he was speaking to someone else, giving change to somebody for a trifle they had just purchased from him. He moved closely to the other side to where the beasts were, trying not to look directly at the thieves, who now he saw actually smiling and laughing and speaking aloud of their relief that his animals were so easy to find. They were really brazen. As they drew close, the thieves were now standing right next to his animals, and he raised that club right up to his waist level, readying himself to inflict as much pain as he could on each one that touched his beast first. It was then that a conversation across on the other side of the alley somehow got his attention. One woman was speaking really loudly. She said, "Did you hear about that fellow Jesus of Nazareth?" And our vendor had heard of him. "I heard he was on his way here to Jerusalem. Why, I actually hear that several people are planning to meet him at the edge of the town and to celebrate his entry into town." Well, he was so distracted by this news that not only did his gaze no longer fall on the thieves, but his club, he found, was resting back on the ground again. A lot of good a rested club will do me, he thought, as he returned his interest to the thieves. Now, to his surprise, the thieves had not laid a hand yet on his beast. In fact, these men were looking at him directly, right in his eyes, and they had these soft smiles and confident expectation on their faces. "Good day, sir," said the first. "Good day," said the second. He opened his mouth, but by then he was confused that they hadn't tried to make the steal. And at the same time, he was still thinking of the ladies who had distracted him earlier in their mention of Jesus' name. And to top it all off, they seemed to be quite friendly fellows, not the likes of most of the criminals that came through that market. What followed was a simple exchange. It actually took only a few seconds. When it was over, he turned to his customers, and with a feeling of fullness and fulfillment and graciousness, he didn't even flinch as his treasured donkey and colt were led away by the men he had first pegged as thieves. He was at peace, far more than he had ever experienced in his life. And as he now cheerfully bartered with his demanding customers, he began to laugh aloud. And he thought to himself as he laughed, "Now my God has surely spoken directly to me." His fellow vendor at the next kiosk saw the donkey and the colt being led away. And so surprised to see them out of the sight of the vendor, he yelled over and said, "Hey, what on earth are you doing? They're walking away with your beasts." And the vendor just smiled at him. "It's okay. They told me that my Lord needed them." In that moment of exchange, that moment between the ladies speaking of Jesus and of our vendors handing over the beasts to these two men, he had played many events over in his head. And in the end, he had imagined his father's words yet again coming to his mind. It was in those brief moments of revelation and thankfulness that his God had spoken to him, and his heart had opened to an extravagant gift-giving. You see, long ago, our vendor had been traveling along the road with his beasts, all laden with wares. He came across this large gathering of people, many of them, the down-and-out types, the kind that rarely made it into the city. They were the pagans, the ones who lived outside of town. They were listening to a fellow atop this rise in the plain. He got there as a fellow from Nazareth was speaking words he had only really heard from the days when he was at Torah school. The words were like a prophet's, a prophet who sounded gracious and caring like the prophets of old. He spoke words of peace to the meek and those in mourning. He spoke words that were kind and gentle, and were words that he had longed to hear spoken aloud because his heart had felt this way in his most vulnerable and tender of moments. He later heard more about giving alms and how to care for treasures. This fellow told the crowds that giving was to be done quietly but generously, fear. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. His beloved father would have really admired this fellow that he was hearing. In that moment between the ladies and handing over the donkey and the colt, our vendor continued thinking back on the days and months following that chance happening out there on the plain when he had first encountered Jesus. As a vendor in the markets of Jerusalem, he heard of all the so-called prophets that came into town, healers, con men too. They were all flashes in the pan. Everyone talked, but few had anything other than great awe for this guy Jesus. His father used to say, "You'll know a man by not only his words, but also his service." He recounted the stories he had heard from the people who bartered with him every week. They told stories of Jesus curing people on the Sabbath. This was a courageous fellow it was. He thought about how he had heard the testimonies of several lame people who had always been customers, who came to his booth one day no longer lame, all claiming that Jesus had cured them. He heard that twice. Not once, but twice. Jesus had somehow provided food for a multitude of people with only the smallest portions of food. Strangely enough, one of Jesus' tales about throwing seed, casting seed, one of them had found its root inside his heart. Our vendor had begun to believe there was something special about this fellow Jesus. Now, it was about this moment that the words of his father again intruded upon his memories of Jesus, and at the same time, the first man, had made the request asking for the donkey. And almost simultaneously, his father's teaching and the man's request for the beast spoke to him it was all one big mush. It was a blur. He was able to decipher later, finally, that the man had asked, "May I take these fine animals? The Lord needs them." And in his memory, his father's teaching spoke at the same time, God will show great care for the righteous. It was far deeper than a knee-jerk reaction to him, and certainly was one that didn't take into account a desire for which to be rewarded. Instead, our vendor was transformed in that moment by a deep desire to be an agent of God's reward. For he didn't care to be seen, nor did he consider the value of righteousness in his actions. It was in Jesus' kindness and generosity, it was in Jesus' compassion, it was in Jesus' name that our vendor saw righteousness and offered up to God, offered up to his new Lord, his most prized and valued possession. On his smiling lips, from his deepest root, came these words, Hosanna. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Friends, take up your palm. Perhaps one more time. Let us raise them and wave them. Let us speak out, Hosanna. Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Hosanna.
Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.
Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna.